we'll work this out. Don't worry, Bart. And thank you for joining us, Professor Bart Kay. What we're going to do, I think, Richard, is we'll mute when Bart talks. Is that what we're going to do? So just for those that don't know you, Bart, if you could just introduce yourself, what your speciality is, and just why we think you're such a great bloke.
Yes, all right. Thank you, Stephen. Very much a privilege, very much a pleasure to be here. Sorry about the technical difficulties. I suggest that it's probably a mix minus channel on my soundboard that isn't doing what it should do. And as such, you guys are getting your own voices back through my microphone feed. So, yeah, the mute thing will work. That's fine. Who am I? Okay, yes, I used to be an academic in the field of human nutrition, the physiology of rest and exercise, cardiovascular pathophysiology for about 25 years until I thought much, much better of that and decided to be a social media influencer instead. And it's good because it gives me now the ability to say what I really think, and I'm not beholden to any curriculum document that tells me what I can and can't say, and so I can present the science now as I see it in a much more balanced way. It's also much more fun to look in the mirror at the boss than it is to have to answer to somebody else. So in a nutshell, that's it for the short version. Yeah.
Well, that's pretty good. Oh, hang on, you've got a mute. No, that's brilliant. Yes. So somebody said, "Is it Red Ted?" Ted. What was the remark? Is Ted fondling the red button or something? Anyway, yeah, Ted has been fondling the red knob again. That's what he said. Right. We can dive straight into questions if that's okay with you, Bart. Give us a thumbs up if that's okay. And Rich, do you know Rich, by the way? Have you met Rich before? Richard Smith? Right. Anyway.
Yeah.
Yes, I haven't met you. Now I have.
Hey there, Bart.
Right.
Yeah, great to meet you. Great to meet you.
Well, let's dive straight into a question, because this is a great question for Professor Bart Kay, because he knows all this sort of stuff, and Richard does as well, and I just pretend to do. So Beef and Fat, that's a good name. Got heart palpitations and tachycardia this morning. Fix the tachycardia with potassium, but still have palpitations. Could it be a histamine problem, as I ate aged steak yesterday?
Yes, it is possible. There are, however, innumerable different things that might be associated with a tachycardia situation, either causally or even coincidentally. Potassium, I presume you mean you fixed tachycardia this morning with potassium rather than ongoingly. It's hard to tell from the question there. Probably the first port of call for me would be to have a look at some of the histamine promoting foods, and if we were going to have consultancy, I'd probably get you to get some testing done to have a look at what's going on in that regard. That might well be my first guess, depending on what the history is. I mean, when we start consulting, myself and any random person, the first thing I'm going to do is spend 15-20 minutes at least with that person getting a history, which is going to give me a steer as to what the likely situation is. So I guess in short, the answer is, yeah, that's possible, but then many things are possible in the world, including technology doing what it should do sometimes. I remember dropping, actually, the use of the StreamYard platform myself some months back because it was not happy with my computer system, audio system, and now I remember why. They don't play nicely. So there's the answer to the question anyway. Beef and Fat, yes, possible.
Rich, do you want to answer?
Yeah, I mean, look, again, without context, it's a bit difficult to say. I mean, there's lots of things that could be contributing to that. It could be, as you say, an electrolyte imbalance, histamine problem. I think we covered this. Did we go through something in regards to aged meat in one of the talks that we did recently, in the way that it's cooked and the histamine? But what else is being consumed as well? I mean, lots of foods will increase histamine, particularly lectins binding into the mast cells in the gut and thing. But it's I think more context required with that one, isn't it? But what are they saying? Fixed tachycardia with potassium, but still have palpitations. Could it be? Yeah, it could very well be. It's a case of trying to find the source, I guess, of that histamine problem. If it is indeed histamine, are you consuming any foods that are high in lectins? And again, aged meat, as we discussed recently, could be a problem. More context required, I think, on that one, isn't there?
Yeah, and I think, as I've said a few times, this isn't a patient doctor relationship. It's just for entertainment and information purposes, and you can do your own research. So, but thank you for that. Beef and fat, that's very good. We'll hide that comment. I have a question that's come in pre-submitted, and I don't think it's really a question. I think it's sort of just a statement, and I think this person wants us to give him some motivation to keep going. All right. So, Professor Bart Kay, this is, but I think, Rich, you could answer as well. I have multiple sclerosis since 2011 and have been carnivore since 2021. Although the lesions on my CNS are healing, I get massively fatigued whenever I eat and I'm having difficulty maintaining and building weight. 193 centimeters tall and 70.3 kilograms. And so I'm guessing this person is asking just for some encouragement that this is the right way, and there could be some resolution in that fatigue, even though they've got MS and they're having those lesions healed.
Right. Yes. Interesting one. These kind of neurological disorders, such as MS, that the medical profession will tell you are intractable, meaning there's not much we can actually do to solve this situation. And as such, the typical approach there is going to be the management of symptomology rather than doing anything about the situation. One of the interesting things that you probably will need to be aware of, if you're not already, is that anyone telling you to avoid cholesterol in your diet or trying to push a statin medication on you for any reason is not doing you a favor, because the myelin sheathing that's so very important to nerve transduction is actually made directly from cholesterol, from molecular cholesterol. So it's very, very important that you have sufficient of that available for use. While your body can produce cholesterol itself from non-cholesterol precursors, so much the better if you feed the body what it needs in terms of its cholesterol, so that it doesn't need to do that and spend effort, I guess, in achieving that goal. So that's the first thing. The second thing that I would suggest to a person with MS, or really any other form of either inflammatory or autoimmune dysfunction, really, is that person, what they ought to be doing to manage their situation to the best end is to live the most anti-inflammatory lifestyle possible. And there are kind of a list of 4 or 5 things that I'm always banging on about with my clients and my people as 5 things that are relatively straightforward, relatively easy for a person to achieve, should they be of a mind to achieve these things, all of which seem to lead people to vastly reduced inflammation and thus the best chance of the best likelihood of the best health outcomes for the longest period of time. And number 1 on the list is eat a 100% carnivorous diet, or as close to that as you can possibly achieve in your lifestyle. Make sure that you're fairly blameless in terms of your diet. the carnivore diet is the most anti-inflammatory diet known to man. So that's, for me, is absolutely number one. Number two is the consumption of a range of nutraceutical products involved in the release and trafficking of adult stem cells and anti-inflammatory effect. For details on that, that's not why we're here today, but for details on that, you can contact me after the show. My email address is fairly easy to find. It's on the About tab on my YouTube channel, that YouTube channel being at Bart-Kay. So I'd be getting into that. Number three is to ground yourself electrically as much of the time as is possible in your lifestyle. Number four is to block blue and artificial wavelengths from your eyes after dark. Sounds like crystal waving woo-woo, I know, but it isn't. There's actual science there. And the fifth thing that I'm always saying to people is the right amount of the right exercise at the right intensity on the right schedule, the right number of times a week. And you do all those 5 things week in and week out. And for my money, that puts you in the best position. I'm sure Richard's got some ideas, though.
No, I mean, it's. I think you've covered pretty much everything there, isn't it? I mean, you know, MS is an inflammatory condition. Inflammation is when the body is under attack, when it attacks itself, isn't it? So living a diet or lifestyle which is combating this, and again, carnivore, I think, is, in my opinion, the most anti-inflammatory diet that we can live. Even within the carnivore community, there are certain foods that can cause inflammation. So, you know, you may be living a carnivore lifestyle. You know, eggs could be causing inflammation. Fish can cause inflammation. Certain dairy products, cheese, and milks. So I would even gravitate maybe towards an all beef and salt type diet, the lion diet. I think that'll probably be the best protocol, unless you are perfectly fine with those other foods. But and again, cholesterol, eating foods as nature intended. We need these saturated fats. We need cholesterol. The myelin sheath is made of cholesterol. It's imperative. You know, cholesterol is imperative for life in general, isn't it? It's imperative for cell formation, cell communication, nutrient absorption, nutrient transportation. It's essential for the immune system, and it's essential for healing. So certainly do not fear cholesterol. And statins, you know, perfect example. Statins block something called the mevalonate pathway, which is how we produce cholesterol. But the mevalonate pathway also helps us produce DNA. So when we're consuming statins, we're preventing the body from being able to produce DNA. So that can, in my opinion, can never be a good thing at any level. But yeah, I mean, the carnivore lifestyle is the most anti-inflammatory lifestyle that we can live. The pure production of just being ketogenic, and the production of beta hydroxybutyrate is going to block NLRP3 inflammasome and reduce inflammation within the body. But in my experience, there are still lots of foods within the carnivore lifestyle, and I'm obviously gravitated into this predominantly from a carnivore context, keto context, but now I'm carnivore. So you need to find what works for you. But the more you gravitate into that carnivore lifestyle, the more chance that you've got for beating that inflammation. I've worked with clients and customers who have tried just being ketogenic and seen massive improvements, but the further that they delve into the carnivore lifestyle, the cleaner they eat, and the more restricted they become in regards to red meat only, the more benefit that they see. But be careful with eggs. Dairy products can cause problems. Fish with some people. Yeah, and that's about it for me. How was that?
Excellent. Hey, it seems like I've sorted out the audio issue by having Ted flick one of the knobs on the desk here to pass control back to live stream, whatever it's called, StreamYard. So there you go. That seems to have been the answer.
Good. Right, yeah, that's great. But I'm pleased about that, because that delay, we had one earlier, didn't we? It was like we were talking on a satellite. Right, Ali D, I think that is. The question is there anything I can do to help with waking up in the middle of the night, both thirsty and having to pee? I've been carnivore for 5 months, 1 year keto prior, 41-year-old male. Right.
Number one, I'm going to take a wild stab in the dark and imagine that you probably changed your diet to carnivore overnight. You hammered over when I'm going carnivore tomorrow, and you just did that. I don't suggest that that's a good idea. I don't think that people should do that. You should always change your diet from whatever it is to whatever you're going to change it into, slowly, glacially, over 6 to 8 weeks, ideally, not an overnight thing. That said, the first things I'd be looking for in this situation, Ellie, would be, I would like to know what your fasting glucose is doing, what your A1C is doing, how much protein you're taking in by way of a dietary recall as accurately as you possibly can for the last several weeks, or failing that, moving forward in the next couple of weeks to track it and see what's going on with that. Well, there would probably look at a few other things in terms of your electrolyte balances, your GFR particularly, perhaps. A few other bits and bobs that we might look at that might point us to what the answer is. But my first guess is going to be a blood glucose dysregulation issue born of a gut microbiome dysfunction, born of changing your diet too suddenly. And these things can rear their heads months and months after the fact. You don't immediately fall to bits necessarily. That's going to be my first guess.
Rich?
Yeah, love that. Nothing to add. Yeah, spot on. I could totally agree. Did I suffer with issues in the beginning? Do you know, I honestly can't remember. It's in my experience, it seems to be an electrolyte issue. But this was a question that popped up earlier as well, isn't it? And it was the same response that we had earlier. Yeah. But fantastic.
Yeah, if it's not a directly protein-related gluconeogenic issue, inflammatory issue around the microbiome, there are other axes that we might look at there as well, including the sex-binding globulin hormone, the free and otherwise testosterone levels, and I would probably look at transferritin as well as my secondary port of call if we can't sort it out immediately. If it's not apparent straight away, oops, too much protein, not enough fat, there's your problem, we need to sort that out, then that's the next route I would suggest. So there you go, there's 2. Jeremiah,
thank you.
Good to see you.
So now the sound is fixed. Have you two met before, Richard and Bart?
Not before today. Now we have.
No,
Richard,
I haven't. Yeah, nice to meet you. I think I did a podcast recently with a mutual friend of ours in Alan Reeves. Alan did a post on how it's all about the calories, and you commented on the post and ripped him apart, and rightfully so. And I messaged him soon after and said, look, we need to do a podcast, because we were recording a series of podcasts at the time. And we recorded that in regards to why, it's not the calories. And we went through that step by step, which was enlightening for Alan. People are still stuck in this whole caloric thing.
Yes.
And that's something that I'd like to touch base on before you shoot off as well. So I've got a few questions as well. But if we want to crack through these, but it'd be great to get you on. I'd love to thrash out a few things. I mean, some of the bits you put out there is incredible content, and it deserves to be shared. And I'd love to chat in more detail in regards to some of that with you. If you could spare some time in the future, that'd be absolutely fantastic.
Look, you bet it would be my privilege and my pleasure. Excuse me. I'm all about the cross-pollination. I have a memory that Mr. Reeves and I actually did have something booked a month or 2 back that he had to cancel for whatever reason, and it was going to be rescheduled, and that just hasn't happened yet. So maybe give him a rattle up, and we'll do a 3-way.
Perfect. Fantastic. Yeah. That'd be fantastic.
Cool.
Fantastic. Well appreciated. Thank you.
Cool. And the thing is, Rich, your story is also good, because I know Bart does have people on with inspirational stories. You could have an inspirational story and then get very scientific as well, which would be fascinating, because it might be the longest interview in the known world. I mean, Bart, you've let yourself in for a big problem there with getting Richard to keep within a couple of hours. Anyway, right, here we go. Question from Jeremiah. Charles, nice name. Someone asked me recently what would be the maximum daily carb intake recommended for a young, non-obese man who is moderately active but has a hard time cutting out all carbs. Wow, that's quite a vague set of parameters, but
yeah.
Go on,
Yeah.
What would you
Well,
think?
look, while we're all human beings, while we all share basically 99% of the same DNA, we have the same organ systems, we have the same requirements, and we can generalize along those lines. Quantifying and placing a number on something like how much carb should a young man intake is a near impossibility, because is that a young man who's 6 foot tall, or is that a young man who's 5 foot tall, for example? I would need to know what is meant by non-obese, because is that a BMI calculation, or is that some other measurement of body composition? And also I would have an issue with the word moderately active. What exactly does that mean in terms of the balances of all of those things? Because all of those things, among a milieu of other degrees of freedom, can affect, let me choose my words carefully here, can affect how much carbohydrate an individual person can tolerate before they get negative side effects of those carbohydrates. There's no ideal amount of carbohydrate unless that amount is 0. However, individually, case by case, from person to person, and indeed between one time and another time, this can differ too, depending on circumstances, you will have a tolerance for how much carbohydrate you can get away with. Why push it? If you want the answer to what's the ideal amount of carbohydrate in the diet, Jeremiah, it's none. You do not require any, not 1 gram ever. Your body makes all the glucose and all the fructose, actually, that it needs. And it does that itself through the biological pathway from non-sugar substrates. So anyone telling you that any amount of intake of carbohydrate is required does not understand biochemistry. Good to see you, by the way, Jeremiah. Good to see you.
Yeah, 0 carbohydrate required. And again, I think, context is important. As you say, it's going to be highly individual. And the source of the carbohydrate, if we're looking at effects on eliciting an insulin response, then a carbohydrate source that are high in lectins is going to be needed to be considerably lower than carbohydrate from something that doesn't contain lectins. Unfortunately, most carbohydrates are high and contain lectins, but lectins will bind to insulin receptors and signal the body to store 5 times more fat than insulin does itself. But 0 carbohydrate, I mean, I'd come back to the question is why, why can't you restrict carbohydrate? I know we've covered several times that, food addiction is a real thing, the effect on the catecholaminergic neurotransmitter synthesis, and the way that the neurotransmitters are made in the brain, and the effect on dopamine and searching for these hits and things. But we can curb, sugar cravings through UVA, through the eyes, through the production of melanocyte stimulating hormone, MSH, through consuming omega-3s, will increase CCK, cholecystokinin. All of these can help curb hunger. Consuming glutamine supplements when you get sugar cravings. I try my best to avoid carbohydrate intake to a detriment. I wouldn't look at it as what level you can consume. As the guys have rightly said, the amount required is in fact 0. And the source of carbohydrate is equally as important. But context, I think, there is important.
Awesome. How are you traveling, by the way, boys? It must be after midnight.
Yeah. What are we on, 16 hours?
Yeah, we're on 16 hours, 25 minutes. And
awesome.
James, who is Richard's tech guy, keeps messaging saying, Stephen, are you really going to stand for the entire 24 hours? I'm going to try, but there is a chair behind me, which occasionally I might sit on because I'm beginning to wane, I will be honest. But if I'd have done this when I was high carb, well, firstly, Before it, I would have been saying to Rich, "Oh, I've got to eat at 9, and I've got to eat at 1, and I've got to eat at 7, and all that bollocks, basically." So anyway, right, I don't normally swear online, but there you go. Bart's here, and he's a bad influence. Here's another question. This is verbal. Pay attention.
You should see that.
Hi, Professor Bart Kay. First of all, thanks for all you do. Now, normally when someone starts with that, it's not going to end well, is it? When someone starts with thanks for all you do, but it's almost like that.
But, yeah.
Right. Here's my question. I think that you have mentioned, unless I got it wrong, and there is, unless I got it wrong, that there is no such thing as metabolic syndrome. Then what would you call the group of symptoms that people have, like large abdomen, high blood pressure, possibly pre-diabetes?
Yeah. Okay. So, yeah, you have worded it more strongly than I would have done in my original offering. What I probably would have said, knowing me, the exact words that I tend to choose, I probably would have said the metabolic syndrome is a construct. It's an idea. It's an umbrella category. It's a bucket of no real actual existence. It's a category that we can put people into should they express X number of selected symptoms and signs from a list, which we will give you. Then we would say clinically that person is in the category of people who have this thing called metabolic syndrome. The problem being that every one of the symptoms listed as a metabolic syndrome symptom are things that can have multiple precipitants. What I guess I'm talking about there is the uncontrolled degrees of freedom, the assertions that people seem to be pathologically determined to make around cause and effect, such statements not being supportable with actual cause and effect empirical evidence, which for those that don't know, empirical evidence just means the numbers. The evidence is the numbers, by the way, not the words. Every time the numbers in the paper. So there's a hint for young players. You don't read a paper and take the conclusions of the authors of that paper as even an accurate description of what that paper actually does say in the numbers section, the results section. So when people say, look, so long as you can read reasonably well, you can follow the science, you can read the science. Well, yes, you can read the words in the paper, but you need specific skills to actually look at a paper critically and go, does this one do what it says it does? Can I expect what it says on the tin here? So that's what I would have said, I suspect, about metabolic syndrome.
Cool. Thank you, Bart. We've got a question from Debbie. Because that was directed, by the way, Rich, that was directed at Bart, so you didn't need to answer. But
I'm
you
glad.
could add. Debbie is asking, what special requirements exist regarding doing the ketogenic or carnivore diet without a gallbladder?
Yeah, nothing really hugely specific, except that we do need to keep an eye on the fat intakes, how it's taken in, how it's broken up, how it's timed during a day, perhaps. It really depends a little bit on how that person is traveling. How long has it been since they've had their gallbladder out, etc., etc., etc. Every client that I speak to or deal with or advise in any way is an individual case. And while the thematics of the ideas that I share with people are often similar, precisely because the underlying etiology, the cause of their problems are similar, it still behooves me to give each individual person individual advice. So to make a blanket statement, a person who has had their gallbladder removed must do these things X, Y, and Z, well, no, because while X and Z might work, Y might not be appropriate on a case-by-case basis. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool.
Yeah, 100%.
Rich?
Yeah, it's a question that I get asked occasionally. Can I live a carnivore lifestyle or ketogenic lifestyle if I've had my gallbladder removed? The liver will ultimately upregulate its production. I know the gallbladder is a means for storing this, but what the advice that I usually give is to increment things slowly, rather than jumping in both feet and consuming lots of fat. Maybe increment it slowly, or even supplement with bile acids to help with with that production. But you can certainly live a ketogenic and carnivore lifestyle if you've had the gallbladder removed. But as you rightly say, isn't it? It is in context, and everyone is an individual, and we need to be careful that we don't give out individual medical advice. This is for educational purposes only. But I've never met anyone that hasn't been able to adopt a ketogenic or carnivore type lifestyle and thrive. In fact, very few people that I can think of that I've worked with who have gravitated, who have maybe teetered out of being carnivore. Most of these people have come back once they've realized that this is the optimal way to live. It's we all live different degrees of strictness in regards to the lifestyle. But the clients that I've worked with, those who teeter out, seem to come back. The opposite isn't true, as somebody made earlier in regards to a vegan who becomes a carnivore. They tend not to go back to becoming vegan, which was a fab statement. But yeah, that's those are my thoughts.
Yeah, I've got a fantastic, simple statement here. There needs to be more on belly fat and insulin resistance. So I think what that is asking about is how do you get rid of stubborn belly fat, and what exactly is insulin resistance? So I think it's quite open. So I'm going to put you two side by side, and then you can chew the fat on it, because I think it'd be very interesting to see what you both come up with.
Yeah, that's a segue into the area that I've been interested in, among other areas, for a while now. What we need to understand is this thing, insulin resistance. Insulin resistance is another construct. It is an idea. It's a diagnostic set of criteria that's been given a label. It's not an actual physiological thing, at least not in the context that we're being led to believe that it is. The simplest way that I can kind of help somebody to understand this a bit, I think, is to say to the person concerned, would you like to go online this afternoon and see if you can find me a company that will supply you with an insulin resistance meter that you can buy, that you can go to your clients with, and you can do some tests on your clients with this insulin resistance meter and measure this physiological thing, insulin resistance, with this meter. You will be waiting a while. There is no such company that makes any such meter, because it's not a physiological thing that can be measured with a meter. The only way to get at insulin resistance is to construct it. And the way we do that is we use blood glucose and blood insulin parameters when we challenge the homeostasis, and we follow the insulin and the glucose over time, and we get a curve for both of those somewhat dependent but also somewhat independent factors. Now, you might say, well, this is a semantic argument a bit, or you might understand that this is actually important, because at the end of the day, the things that affect your insulin resistance result on your insulin resistance test are the amount of insulin being produced versus the amount exiting the bloodstream, combined with the amount of glucose entering and exiting the bloodstream, all of that under the influence of the inflammasome, the endocrine system, the hormonal system, that all plays into how all of that plays out. Let's not forget our old friend Randall with his bicycle. that plays into that as well. And at the end of the day, at any given time, at any given instant, any one cell, ergo any group of cells, tissues, organ, or even the whole body, can get into a state where it is not interested, for want of a better term, is not interested in insulin. It will not react to insulin. The glucose existing in the bloodstream at that time will be locked out of entering the cells. And when I say locked out, this is not a turnkey on-off situation. It's a fader. It's a sliding scale. But a person who is unable at that time to get blood glucose to exit the blood and enter the cells instead, that is happening for a reason. It's physiologically indicated. It occurs precisely because the DNA that survived at least 4,000 million years encodes directly for the enzymes that cause that set of interactions to occur. It's not a mistake, it's not a pathology, it's not a disease state, and it's not something that needs to be fixed. It occurs because it is supposed to occur. And the reason for 99-point-something% of all so-called insulin resistance, when it's evident, is the Randall cycle, which is doing what it is supposed to do precisely in order to protect the cells from damage. It's not a disease. It's not a pathology, and it's not a bad thing. Interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, and it is. I think it can get incredibly technical as well, isn't it? And the Randall cycle is something that I wanted to go on to, because I know that it's something that you've versed in incredibly well, isn't it? But I mean, coming back to Sheena's point there, on a simplistic level, I mean, what she's saying there is, I think that being insulin resistant in the normal sense, what she's saying needs to be more on belly fat and insulin resistant. But I mean, it's when we look at insulin within the body, this increases over time, isn't it? So when we check for diabetes, anyone on the high street could be checked for diabetes and show a negative test, but it doesn't mean that their insulin levels in the blood aren't elevated. And typically somebody who is insulin resistant, this insulin resistance began 10 to 15 years prior to that, isn't it? Most of us on the high street are in the standard sense insulin resistant, but in terms of what, as you rightly say, insulin resistance in terms of what cell, and that is pertinent. But the Randall cycle is something that's had a lot of airtime recently. Can you explain to the listeners what the Randall cycle is and why it's been controversial recently? I mean, this is quite a complex topic, I think, isn't it? So I'd love to hear your scientific thing to it, and if you could break it down into layman's terms as well. Sure. That'd be fantastic.
Yeah, look, before I mentioned it the first time, about maybe 4.5 years ago on social media, nobody was talking about the Randall cycle. It was a paper that everybody had forgotten about, it seemed. It was almost filed in the bottom of someone's filing cabinet, never to be seen again, gathering dust, I don't know. Basically what it is, well, first of all, it's not a cycle, so I don't know why it's called a cycle. That's
right. Yeah.
It's not a cycle. It's a series of interactions between various components, if you like, of the kit that we would call the metabolic pathway at large. It functions at a whole body level via its effects at a cellular level within cells. Basically what occurs is, if you have a lot of blood glucose and a lot of free fatty acid in the blood, for want of a better term, competing for access to the mitochondria to produce energy in a cell, the fat and carbohydrate tend to cross-inhibit one another. It's like, the analogy I often use is like two fat men trying to jam their way through a revolving door at the same time, thus preventing either one of them from effectively getting through. So I already said it before, but I'll say it again. The Randall cycle is not an on-off thing. You don't turn it on and turn it off. It's a sliding scale. It's on a fader, and it's per the cell. Each individual cell has its own functioning Randall cycle, which slides the fader up and down in terms of how much that cell will be amenable to the uptake of glucose from the blood to that cell. If a cell is replete with energy substrate and needs no further energy at that time, the Randall cycle will be fully faded on. The doors to glucose will be effectively locked in that cell, locked out completely, for want of a better term, and the glucose will not be able to enter that cell at that time. Makes sense, because too much glucose in a cell will damage that cell, glycation. So what do? We lock the door to the cell, the much more complex, much more important, much more difficult cells to replace, like heart cells, other muscle cells, etc. And we go, oh, well, the sacrificial lamb then is the red blood cells and the vascular epithelial cells, because they can be replaced much more rapidly. They're a much more simple cell. That's the natural design. Occasionally, we might have got a bolus of carbohydrate that led to a whole bunch of sugar entering our bloodstream. No big deal. Lock it out so we don't damage our important cells. The red cells cop it, but that's okay, because every couple of months we're going to replace those with new ones, under the biological assumption that our availability for carb was very low, which it was throughout most of our evolution. Now we live in a society where we're constantly pouring carbohydrates down our stupid necks 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times a day, some of us. Every single time, that's doing damage. There are no free rides on carbohydrates. So what is the Randall cycle? It's that protective mechanism that locks the cells out to the damage that would be caused were those cells allowed to accumulate sugar inside the cells, according to its concentration gradient in the blood. That's what it is. That's what it does, pretty much.
Love it. So, I mean, how would you... One of the comments that I've heard recently is long-term, ketosis, or being ketogenic or carnivore, for another matter, will create peripheral insulin resistance through the Randall cycle. So how can we apply what you've just said, to that? And is there anything to that? I mean, one of the concerns is that living the lifestyle for too long is going to lead to this peripheral insulin resistance. Go on, fire away.
Yeah. So number one, once again, the first thing that we need to do is adjust our attitude and stop thinking of so-called insulin resistance as a pathology in need of either avoidance or repair. How do we fix this insulin resistance? We don't. It's there for a reason. It's encoded for in the very genes. It's doing its job perfectly. If you have high blood glucose or high blood insulin, or both, there is something wrong with your diet. Your diet is pathological. That is what needs fixing, not your body's reaction to your pathological diet. Does that make sense?
Yeah, love that. Yeah.
So there's nothing wrong with the ketogenic diet long term, with the caveat that the goal of a ketogenic diet is not to be in ketosis, to have ketones. The more, the better. No. The purpler that stick, the better. No. Throw those sticks away, please, people. Don't ever test your urine for ketones again. It will not provide you with any information of any utility whatever. It's a gimmick. It's a have. It's a way of fleecing you of your hard-earned pounds, squid dollars, whatever. You don't need to do that. What you do need to do is to consume the majority, if not the entirety, of your daily bolus of protein in a single intake, or two at most, in my mind. The reason for that is because you need enough protein coming in one bolus to slightly kick the gluconeogenic pathway into action just a little bit. I'm not talking about a spike that you will get from eating carbohydrate. I'm talking about a little sleeping policeman. That is sufficient generally on a daily basis to maintain the integrity of your kidney tissue and its ability to filter electrolytes in and out, thus to maintain your electrolyte balance. It also prevents thyroid failures that you can get on long-term ketogenic diets, unless you happen to be an Inuit, in terms of your genetic background. But we need to understand that the goal of the ketogenic diet is usually, for most people, one of or both of the reduction in adiposity, loss of body fat, and anti-inflammatory effect of the ketogenic lifestyle. The people that are running around saying the ketones in and of themselves are of some benefit, and indeed you should take exogenous ketones, no, it's rubbish. There's no science to back that. Anyway, that's my take on that one.
Fantastic.
But that's okay.
So what about, let's go on to calories. So a massive swear word for you. This has been
the C word.
This has been a reoccurring factor through the entire, what are we in, 16 odd hours. My take, you can add to this or rip it apart, but it's not the calories that govern whether we gain or lose weight if people are looking at it from that context. The caloric model is highly flawed.
Yes.
It's a highly antiquated system. It doesn't account, in my opinion, for the effect of insulin, the thermic effect of food, ketogenesis, metabolic rate, and the effect of lectins on insulin. It's not the calories. Energy needs to be accounted for. And I use the term energy over calories because calories are not the best way to quantify this. I call it energy. I think you refer to it as heat, which is a fantastic term. Do you want to go into a little bit more detail in regards to that? The whole caloric model, and anyone who uses, that sort of that I can understand in regards to referencing when we're speaking to people who don't understand being ketogenic or carnivore, and trying to explain how we can consume X amount of energy throughout the day. So I can consume between 5,000 to 6,000 calories on a carnivore ketogenic lifestyle and maintain weight. On a high carb lifestyle, at 2,500 to 2,700, I will gain weight continuously week after week after week. Yet the caloric model, if taken from calories, is considerably higher when I'm on a ketogenic or carnivore lifestyle. So it clearly isn't the calories, it's the source of that energy, it's the source of the heat. And these are things that being ketogenic, can't account for. It's not the calories. Do you want to go into a little bit more detail?
Yeah, look, my pleasure. Yeah, my pleasure. I'm sure it's, I'm just rambling, so I'm not sure it's a pleasure to go through this. I'm going to say it's a pleasure. Why not? Here we go. All right. Energy is another one of these constructs. It's another thing that cannot be directly measured. It can't be held. It can't be looked at. It can't be contained, per se, actually. The only way that we can gauge or put a metric on so-called energy at all is to observe the effects that so-called energy, the construct energy, has on physical matter, stuff, a system of particles of some kind. Example, the calorie is a measurement specifically and explicitly of heat energy. You've probably all heard the colloquial version of the what's called the law of conservation of energy, which was originally asserted, I guess, among others, by the mathematician Emily Noether in the last century. And she mathematically established reason to assert that, in effect, energy cannot be created from nothing, neither can it be destroyed and made into nothing. It can only be changed from one form into another form. So the analogy, if you like, is currency. I cannot go into Sainsbury's local tomorrow in the UK. Number one, because I'm in New Zealand, and that would be hard to get. But let's say I was in the UK. I can't go into Sainsbury's local tomorrow and put 10 New Zealand dollars on the counter and buy roughly £6 worth of goods using that New Zealand legal tender. It's money. Absolutely, it's money. In the same way that heat energy is one of the forms of energy. But if the form of energy that you require is kinetic, then another form of energy might not be any good to you. In the same way that the shopkeeper in the local Sainsbury's is not going to accept my $10 New Zealand as being equivalent to £6 sterling, give or take, whatever the exchange rate is today. These are different currencies, but they are all currencies. So energy, one form to another, heat, ionizing radiation, kinetic, potential, chemical, etc. All different forms of so-called energy, all with so-called equivalences, meaning that if we measure one form of energy, then we know how much energy the system is using, is balanced at, whatever. But that is the worst kind of reductionism possible, really. Because, number one, the experimental work done to establish what the equivalence between a calorie and a kilojoule is was dodgy at best. You need to look that thing up if you don't know how that was done, for example. It involved a researcher hundreds of years ago dropping fixed weights from a fixed height into containers of water and measuring the change in the temperature of the water bath under the influence of having this weight smack into it. Hello. Anyway, that's for another day. Heat energy, what is it? What is a calorie? A calorie is measured as the effect of rapidly combusting instantaneously a food sample inside a closed bomb calorimeter and seeing how much a bath of water surrounding that closed thermodynamic system heats up under the influence of burning that substance of food, that sample, whatever it is. Huge electrical current put through this bit of cheese, for example. It goes woof, combusts, releases out heat, which then propagates out, hits the walls of the bomb calorimeter, warms those up. The walls of the bomb calorimeter then pass that heat onto the water bath surrounding it. Hey presto, change in temperature of the water around the bomb calorimeter. Fantastic. Okay, so this heat that propagates out, what form does that take? Well, it's photons. It's set wavelength. It's infrared photons. That's what heat is. And the only way you can pass heat from one body to another is by the exchange of photons between those bodies at various energy levels to change the energy status such that the total energy is shared evenly between two bodies in contact over a period of time. Entropy increases, basically. Disorder increases, everything evens out in the universe. Fantastic. Okay, so when we burn rapidly a food sample inside a bomb calorimeter, we release photons. Do you know what the rest mass of a photon is, Richard?
I do not.
Zero.
Photons have no rest mass. They weigh nothing. They have no spatial extent. They do not literally exist. So, literally. They have no literal existence.
Oh, I'm going to be really, I'm going to have to cut in here because we have to stop in about 3 minutes.
Okay, so I get the last bit done quickly then.
Yeah, sorry, mate. I'm sorry. Because StreamYard can't do 24 hours in a row, so we have to go over to another studio.
Okay, so the next time we do this, we probably need to have guests on for longer than, Anyway, that's for another day. Right, so photons weigh nothing. Nothing at all. That being said, the loss or gain of photons by a body, how does that affect your weight? given that your weight is the mass exerted by you on a weighing scale under the influence of gravity because of the physical mass of the molecules in your body. So take any number you like at all, 70 kilos. Add any number of photons to that mass, all of which weigh nothing. The change in your mass is nothing. Lose any amount of photons and your weight is similarly unchanged. The only way to change your weight is to expire carbon dioxide gas, which has a weight, a mass, or to produce water, which you then urinate out, sweat out, comes out in your tears, your saliva, and other insensible losses like vapor at the lungs. It's not calories in, calories out. It's mass in, mass out. Mass is the only acceptable terminology to use, the only acceptable model for body composition claims, not energy. Energy and mass have an equivalence, but it's one of those exchange rate things on different currencies. So that's the take home, that's the skinny, that's the quickly truncated, abbreviated version of the calories argument. Calories don't weigh anything, they can't affect your weight. Only mass can. It's a mass in, mass out exercise. That's an unassailable argument.
I'm sorry, but if I just explain, StreamYard can give me 50 hours of recording, but they can't do 24 hours in a row. So we have to have 3 separate studios.